Welcome to Unit 2 in our Modern Latin American History class. In this unit, we'll be reading the chapter in Chastin on Latin American independence movements. Those movements took place between about 1810 and 1830, although they took different shapes and different forms depending on what specific region in Latin America that we're looking at. For example, in Mexico and Peru, independence ended up becoming a much more conservative goal than was the case in the northern part of South America, or even in Chile and in Argentina. So as we go through this unit, think about what does that mean in terms of the early 19th century. Terms like liberal and conservative meant different things during that moment in time and in the context of Latin American history than they do in today's U.S. political context, for sure. Latin America's independence began in part because of the decline and situation that the Spanish Empire found itself in, and the Portuguese Empire to a certain extent, at the end of the colonial period. Of course, people who were living in that moment in the 1700s and early 1800s didn't realize necessarily that they were in the end of an era, that the colonial rule wasn't going to last for too much longer. The Spanish and Portuguese governments issued reforms. In Spain, they were called the Bourbon Reforms, named after the royal family in charge of Spain at the time in the late 1700s. And in Portugal, they were known as the Pombaline Reforms, named after the Marquis de Pombal. In both of those empires, these reforms targeted the declining fortunes of both Spain and Portugal, and they sought to reassert royal authority in the colonies. In doing so, however, they kind of sowed the seeds for eventual independence that would come during the time frame that I just mentioned, between about 1810 and 1830. Because of the effort to streamline public administration and kind of reassert the power of the state, especially over the church, there were rifts between existing rivals in the colonies. In the Spanish colonies, peninsulares, or as they're referred to by Chastin, peninsulars, they were people who were born in Spain and who were given positions of authority, given wealth and titles and nobility in the Americas simply because they had the ear of the king, simply because he knew them well and he felt he could trust them. Those people displaced a lot of criollos, or creoles as Chastin refers to them in the text. I like to use the Spanish terms because, especially in the case of Creole, Creole means something very different if you're in the American South along the Gulf Coast than in the case of Latin America. In Latin America, the criollos, these were people who were of Spanish descent. They could make claims on whiteness and on a pure blood connection back to Spain, whether or not those were true. They could make those claims. They had wealth. They had all the markers of Spanish culture and education. But they'd been born in the Americas, and that was the one thing that really made them different than the peninsulares. So as you might imagine, the criollos were very upset that they were displaced by peninsulares during the period of reform. Similar patterns emerged as well in Brazil, Portugal's colony. While all of this was going on, the Bourbon Reforms made some positive changes in terms of streamlining the government, reasserting royal authority, and so on, but they opened those rifts, and then in 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte took control of Spain and he also did take control of Portugal, but as he moved in, the Portuguese royal family in its entirety was shipped off by the British to Rio de Janeiro. So they were able to escape and kind of reestablish the government in Rio and rule from there. In Spain, however, Fernando VII, he was essentially taken captive, deposed by Napoleon, and Napoleon put his brother Joseph on the throne. Throughout Spain and throughout the Spanish Americas, different groups, especially of criollos who had control of urban councils called cabildos, they established what they called the Cortes. These were, again, kind of local governments that claimed to be ruling in the name of Fernando until he could come back and take his rightful place as king. In the process of establishing these cortes with these cabildos, many people started to think, well, wait a minute, maybe we should just declare our independence from the Spanish Empire, especially because the French are in command. In 1814, early efforts by Simón Bolívar in Mexico, famed leaders like Miguel Hidalgo and Jose Maria Morelos, they had been captured and executed during the period of kind of early Cabildo rule and early efforts at independence. By the time that Napoleon was captured and exiled in Europe, and power went back to Fernando, there was some trepidation about giving authority back to the king, especially because he wanted to set aside the constitutional changes that had been established during his absence. So all these cortes, these cabildos, they were busy. They created what was known as the Constitution of 1812. It was based on liberal ideals from the Enlightenment age, such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, separation of powers, and he was not necessarily willing to rule as a constitutional monarch, meaning that his authority would be checked by this constitution. Long story short, in 1820, he was forced to accept that constitution, but when that happened, especially in Mexico and in Peru, as I mentioned, the powers that were in Lima and Mexico City realized that they might lose some of their authority and their control because the monarch was now going to become a constitutional monarch. So what they did is they threw in their lot for independence. And so although people like Simón Bolívar in what became Venezuela, Colombia, a little bit Bolivia, the country that bears his name, he was fighting all of the time as an independence leader for liberal ideals. In Mexico and Peru, independence was much more of a conservative goal, meaning that we wanted to keep in place the existing social structure and the political structure, but along the way, different independence leaders on any political side had to get the support of the people. And in order to do that, as Chasteen outlines it, they spoke in terms of nativism. They talked about us versus them, Americanos, people from the Americas, Criollos and down, versus those from Europe. So people from Europe were disdained, they were called derogatory names. Of course, there was violence of all the wars, and out of all of those ashes, a bunch of different kind of shaky nations, I say shaky nations because they were on relatively shaky foundations, emerged between 1820 and 1830. Those nations kind of had to figure out what their identity was, what kinds of government they would have, and those kinds of debates, as well as heavy foreign debt, especially to Great Britain and France, meant that they weren't in a very good position to get things rolling. Women and people of African descent in particular had supported the independence movement, as we'll read about in Chasteen and we'll also see in Wood in the various readings that we'll do in that chapter. But despite their support, they didn't necessarily receive any of the benefits of these new liberal reforms that they were hoping for. In other words, women didn't get additional rights in public life, meaning they weren't able to kind of leave the home, work, have influence in politics and elsewhere. But they were able to challenge the patriarchal standard that was there. So hopefully this brief outline that I've given you will help you understand how to put together the various details that you read in Chasteen and Wood, and then the Wood chapter that we'll also be reading, to understand what Chasteen means when he says that so much changed with Latin American independence, yet so much stayed the same. I hope you enjoyed the unit.